The year is 1776. The place is Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A group of men are about to change the world forever. For years before this, the 13 British colonies in North America had been growing increasingly frustrated with the policies and actions of their mother country. They were being heavily taxed for many things, including tea, sugar, and paper. The cry of no taxation without representation had become a common one. The colonists felt as though they were being punished by the British government, but had no say in how they were being governed. And this tension just kept building and building. Then came the Boston Tea Party in 1773, where colonial protesters disguised as Native Americans snuck onto merchant ships and dumped 92,000 pounds of tea into the Boston harbor, an act of defiance against the Tea Act passed by Parliament. Then came the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts, which were passed by the British government in response to the Boston Tea Party. These acts were intended to punish the Massachusetts Bay Colony and to force them to comply with British rule. However, these acts only inflamed the situation further and caused more protests and rebellions among the colonists. And soon the whole of the American colonies were rising up and calling for freedom from British control. In response to the growing unrest, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met up at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in May of 1776. There, they discussed their grievances with the British government and debated whether they should break away from Britain and declare independence or try to negotiate a compromise. This was a momentous occasion and would be the first of many such meetings that would occur over the next few months. But it was far from a united group that gathered here. Many of those present still had loyalties to the crown, seeing themselves first and foremost as British subjects. And there was much debate about the future of the colonies. But it was clear that something had to be done. And so a committee was formed consisting of Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Robert Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut, with Thomas Jefferson as its head to draft a document that would explain the reasons for the colony's desire to break away from Britain and declare themselves a free and independent nation. This was a huge task, and Jefferson knew that he had to write carefully if he wanted the document to be accepted by the other members of the Continental Congress. So, where did he start? Well, according to legend, as he sat down to write, his daughter Martha walked in and asked him what he was doing. He simply replied, "Writing the thoughts of the day." And she said, "What are they?" And he answered that all men are created equal. And indeed, he believed that all men were created equal. But, unfortunately, he didn't believe that all men were created equally free. Jefferson himself was a slave owner, and the original draft of the Declaration contained several references to slavery. In fact, in an earlier draft he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government." Notice anything missing? Yep, that's right. This early draft of the Declaration had the infamous line, "All men are created equal." But in later drafts, that line and others like it were removed. Why were they removed? Well, there are a few theories. The most popular One is that it was done to ensure that all 13 colonies would sign off on the document. At the time, the issue of slavery was a very divisive one, and many of the southern colonies relied heavily on the institution of slavery. By removing the references to slavery, Jefferson and the other members of the committee were able to create a document that all 13 colonies could agree on, thereby ensuring that they would all sign off on it. And that's why, my friends, the line "all men are created equal" was removed from the Declaration of Independence. But it wasn't just that. There were many other changes made to the document before it was finally adopted. For example, in an earlier draft Jefferson had written, "He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and is giving the of war to savage and barbarous nations, whose total want of civilization is a savage and barbarous excuse for the most inhuman and bloody purposes." As you can see, Jefferson clearly identifies Native Americans as savage and barbarous, a reflection of the views held by many colonists at the time. However, when the final draft was presented to the Continental Congress, that language had been toned down. Instead, it simply read, "He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and is carrying on a war with us." This change was made in order to appease the Iroquois Confederacy, who were at the time still officially neutral in the conflict between the colonies and Britain. But who knows? Maybe they too were tired of being called savages. Another change made to the document was the removal of a section that criticized King George III. In the original draft, Jefferson had written, "He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us." This section was seen as too inflammatory, and it was feared that if it remained in the document, it would cause the king to retaliate against the colonies even more harshly, so it was removed in the final draft. But despite these changes, the Declaration of Independence was still a radical document. It went against everything that the world had known for hundreds of years. The idea that people were born with natural rights that governments could and take away was a new one. And the idea that they had the right to overthrow their government if it became tyrannical was even more radical. But in the end, it was these very ideas that made the Declaration of Independence so powerful. It was a document that spoke to the aspirations of people everywhere, and it continues to inspire people today. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress voted to approve the Declaration of Independence, which had been largely written by Thomas Jefferson. Bells were rung, bonfires were lit, and celebrations broke out across the colonies. But, as the colonists knew, the hard fighting was just beginning. The Revolutionary War would rage on for another 7 years, and the path to victory was far from certain. But thanks to the Declaration of Independence, the colonists had something to fight for, a vision of a new nation based on the principles of liberty and equality. But while the Declaration of Independence is a powerful symbol of freedom, it's important to remember that the truth is often more complicated than the words on a page. Yes, the document proclaimed that all men are created equal, but as we've seen, that simply wasn't true. At the time, there were many people in America who were not considered equal under the law, including African Americans, women, and Native Americans. And it's important to remember that the Declaration of Independence was a product of its time. The ideas expressed in it were the ideas of the Enlightenment, an intellectual movement that emphasized reason and individual rights. But the people who were espousing those ideas weren't always willing to apply them to everyone. Despite this, the Declaration of Independence remains an important document, not just for Americans, but for people all over the world. It's a symbol of the potential for humanity to create a better world, a world based on freedom and equality. And while we may never fully realize the ideals of the Declaration, we can still strive to make it a reality. And if you want to learn more about the Declaration of Independence, check out the additional resources. Thanks for watching.